Hello, beautiful souls. How are you? Thank you for tuning back in. This is Founding Fathers Discovery Series, Episode 5, Part 2 for Richard Nixon. This is where everything gets super juicy. Trigger warning, trigger warning. There's going to be some things that you're going to go, what is she talking about? Just know that I do my best to give you the information that has been confirmed to Source Creator. Ultimately, a lot of the truths are not written, they're not cited, they're not really in places where you can find them easily. You have to use your discernment. And so I make these videos for entertainment purposes and hopefully enlighten you a little bit. So let's go. I left off last episode with the truth about the Apollo 11 moon landing. So now let's get into more truth, shall we? This is a little bit cumbersome because there's a lot going on with President Nixon. But I think it's super interesting, and I think I'm giving you a lot of information, but it definitely helps to paint a very clear picture, especially knowing what we now know. So buckle up. Okay. Watergate encompasses several illegal activities undertaken by Nixon administration. Bugging the offices, harassing of political opponents and activists, targeting political figures. Does this sound familiar at all? Yeah, I thought so. All was brought to light when 5 Nixon staffers were found in the Democratic National Committee office after hours, June 17th, 1972. When the Washington Post picked up the story, they relied on an informant known as Deep Throat, aka Mark Felt, Felt, aka the Associate Director of the FBI. The Associate Director of the FBI, Mark Felt, was the informant for the Watergate story to the media, and his informant code name is Deep Throat, which had a direct correlation to a popular pornographic film and star at the time. Okay. It was this FBI associate director of the FBI that linked the 5 staffers to Nixon. I immediately downloaded that moniker of Deep Throat was given as threat. There were video and photographic evidence held as blackmail over Mr. Mark Felt, because he was in acts, illegal acts, and they were recorded. And so he had no choice but to be the informant. And they reminded him that he had no choice by giving him the name Deep Throat. Nixon called a spade a spade. And with these reports, Nixon said they're political and all news was biased, repeating the same narrative that we have been hearing in the last several years. Now, this was in 1972, 74. This just showed me how long the media has been corrupt. Now, this is also very interesting. The main reporters covered Watergate were Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. If you're thinking, I heard that name before, Bob Woodward is known for many reasons. He's written many books. But one of them is the unauthorized biography of one Donald John Trump during the first presidency. Same guy. Later, the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon, that was the name of it, the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon, including White House staffers, were found culpable with sabotage of the Democrats, and 48 different officials were convicted of wrongdoing of these Watergate events. As you already know, the witch hunt was underway. But the court of public opinion was running with the mainstream stories. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? So, this brings me back to the soul, the being that was with Nixon at the time. I said, what was the goal of Watergate? This is what they, in quotes, became unhinged when I created the DEA and then appointed Elvis as an agent. It sent them, in quotes, over the edge, so to speak, in quotes. How dare a president create an agency that can keep an eye and oversee the FBI? Yes, you heard that correctly. The true purpose behind the DEA was to make sure the FBI wasn't being weaponized against the U.S. citizens and to get the mafia out of our government agency. The FBI was weaponized the instant Hoover oversaw and listened in on all the White House phone calls. Hoover had the entire White House bugged, with the exception of 1 to 2 rooms. Yeah. So remember that. Remember that while I keep going through all this. Remember it. It should really start to paint a much more logical and clear picture of what was happening. On November 17th, 1963, during a Q&A with 400 Associated Press managing editors, Nixon stated, "People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. I am not a crook. I've earned everything I've got." And that also sounds very familiar. I feel like this is played out time and time again when the good guy is in the office and can't be bought. The support for Nixon fell sharply with this wiretap recordings released, showing he knew shortly after Watergate and tried to thwart the investigation because he knew it was baseless. Not and Hoover had the recordings and wiretapped the White House, the entire White House. It was known. And so he really thought this was like a nothing burger. But because of the culpability and the collaboration of those who wanted to make sure he was not going to remain in the White House, because he was messing things up for them, in my opinion. Okay. On August 9th, 1974, he delivered a televised resignation speech and Nixon resigned. For the good of the country, Nixon asked for support of then Vice President Gerald Ford. When I saw this, I thought, well, that wasn't his vice president. The original vice president, Agnew, resigned due to charges of bribery and tax evasion in Maryland when he was the governor. So this was prior to his VP stint. So this occurs. He's brought up on charges. Agnew is found guilty. He resigns from his VP post. They Nixon and the cabinet appointed Gerald Ford vice president. On September 8, 1974, Gerald Ford gave Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon, ending any probability or possibility of indictment. Ultimately, the fallout cost 49 Republican seats in the House and 4 in the Senate. Over the next 20 years, Nixon wrote his memoirs, traveled the United Kingdom, China, Soviet Union, garnering deep respect for his foreign emissary and relations to help stabilize the powerful nations that the United States developed policy with. Now, going back to some of the things that Nixon had a role in that really helped develop his passion for public office. I'm going to point out a few things that also laid the groundwork for him not being the best president in terms of sharing the wealth with all the different hands that are out and being as president. Labor Management Relations Act of 1947, it's also known as the Taft-Hartley Act, was a federal law that restricted activities and power of labor unions. So again, he is poking the bear of the labor unions, and labor unions are vastly known to have deep ties with organized crime syndicates. Truman vetoed this, but the 80th U.S. Congress passed it into law June 23rd, 1947. What did this change for the unions? Members could still organize and bargain collectively, but it was outlawed that they had closed shops, that they had workers' rights to join the union, made the union leaders take a non-communist oath, and made labor unions liable for damages that resulted from jurisdictional disputes. So as you are looking through these amendments and laws that were passed, you can see that they're passed because of this wild abandon for life and liberty and freedom that was being exercised by these different labor unions and the organized crime, which controlled everything. Overall, unions were to bargain collectively for the workers about their wages, their hours, and working conditions. That was another big hook, working conditions. Nixon took on many of these powerful interconnected industries with the EPA, OSHA, the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969. That was a big one. So, culmination of this strong enforceable safety protections, federal inspectors were given the authority to shut down mines when life-threatening hazards were found. And in that time, coal mines were life-threatening hazards, like period. They're basically like, if you're going to work in this town, you're going to do what we tell you to do. And yeah, it's dangerous, and that's okay. And no, if you get hurt, we're not responsible for that. It's on you. That's how they operated things prior to this legislation. So you can see how the various entities that controlled these mines were not happy. The EPA, the U.S. Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Agricultural Forest Service, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and state agencies had roles now to regulate mining. And that is a lot of hands in the pot, so to speak. OSHA had a broader authority and jurisdiction over the most private sector employees and employees as well as some public sector employees. So now you have these government agencies that would go in and inspect and deem a site safe or not, deem an act of injury the responsibility of the mine or the responsibility of the worker. The factories that sprang up after the Civil War were death traps due to many dangerous factory laws or no laws at all, like none. Chemicals, dust, dangerous machines, confusing and jumbled belts, bolts, pulleys, gears were often confronted by very young workers. Ding, ding, ding. Please go back and look at my orphan train video. The orphan trains, the whole concept was completely abhorrent, but one of their functions was to staff these big industry plants. And there are many images, just Google it, of children, child labor, operating very dangerous machinery. And there were many, many horrific deaths and accidents. And because these were orphans, they were seen as expendable. And a lot of it was not reported at all until some insiders went in these factories, took jobs undercover, and saw for themselves. And then they were shocked at what they saw. The reports from state labor bureaus of the 1870s, 1880s were full of tragedies. These statistics collected by states' labor bureaus spurred social reforms in a budding labor movement. By 1890, 9 states provided factory inspectors and 13 required machine guards. 21 made limited provisions for health hazards. Quickly, the trend of states with strong safety and health laws tended to lose industry to those states with less stringent laws, causing much competition for injury. So you can see here where the entity controlling the work would move the factories to a state that had less safety laws and policies. So this was better for business, not better for people. In 1907, with national news assistance, the coverage of 362 coal miners killed in West Virginia spurred a national movement for worker safety. The same year, in 1907, an article named Making Steel and Killing Men was published based on the first investigation in a Chicago mill. It was estimated that of 1,200 of every 10,000 workers annually are killed or maimed. So every year there was 1,200. That's 100 a month killed or maimed on the job. The steel mill were the first to mandate safety first. Quotes, safety first. In the same years, 1907 and 1908, a survey was completed in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, of employees with major accidents and found the workers and surviving associated families had to bear the financial cost of whatever injuries, healthcare, burial, all the things. They had to bear the burden and also the loss of income because employers had no responsibility, no official responsibility. These were all early grassroots efforts to what became workers' compensation insurance. The 3 laws as part of Roosevelt's New Deal were Social Security Act of 1935, which made public health services, who began studies in 1914 as a national leader. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, this set the minimum wage and banned exploiting child labor. Again, child labor was a big issue. Boring workers under 18 years of age from dangerous occupations. Again, check out the orphan train video. And the Walsh-Healy Public Contracts Act of 1936, this allowed to ban contracts under hazardous conditions. So any contracts that were found to be involving hazardous conditions could be null and void based on that one factor. After years of increasing desire to bring health and safety standards to the workplace, Nixon's proposal was vehemently opposed by labor unions. As you can see, there's been a ramp up of all these different government agencies telling them what they should do and what they can't do anymore, and all the things that, it costs money. 1, 2, 3, 4 on the clock. It costs money to make a business safe. It costs money to put in safety processes, where they did not want to do that. They were about the bottom line. And they didn't like being told what to do either. But what was supported by the Manufacturers Association, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, most Democrats aligned with labor unions and did not support legislation until the much looser liberal views on industry were added, and then it passed the House and the Senate. OSHA of 1970 became official. Is that an eye-opener for you? I'm just curious to know that the Democrat Party, the ones actually elected, not the party, but the ones elected that put forth policy and procedure and whatnot, hugely opposed safety, health, responsibility, workers' compensation. They aligned with the unions. Now, why do you think that is? Because historically, the unions are about good old boy, and you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And so, my intuition, my discernment says, well, in order for them to oppose the labor unions were paying them off. I mean, why do you think they all come out of these congressional and Senate seats and however long they're in, multimillionaires when their salaries, yes, it's six figures, but it's not multimillionaire six figures. Because of the enforcing of regulations that protected environment, people at work, drug-related woundings, this was cutting into the cabal profits. They, again in quotes, wanted Nixon taken out. The oil crisis of 1973 was the final straw. They found culpable administration staffers willing to set him up with the Watergate scandal. Why do you think it was at the Democratic National Office? It had to be the DNC to pull in all the unions and the Democrats to be voting against any Republican. Again, told what they wanted you to believe instead of the truth. Nixon was good for the people and bad for business president. Now, another bit of information from the soul that was with Nixon. I met with JFK before I ran and during my presidency. Later in the 90s, I met with him and DJT and JFK Jr. and Diana to coordinate many of the 500D chess moves you're seeing be made now. When we met, you could say we collaborated our source light to shine in many areas of darkness like only we could in our earthly roles. There are some pieces that I'm going to touch on now. These are all my personal takes, my divination, my opinion, my intuition. So we see our country being overrun with immigrants at every border, northern border, southern border, it doesn't matter. There is really no secure border of the United States anymore. We've seen a lot of parties take place in moving these beings all across the country, really without consent and in no one's best interest, to be honest. So when I lived in Texas, and this was first happening, let's see, 2020, 2021. This would have been 2021. There were caravans of buses coming into downtown Houston, and there were citizen journalists down there videoing what was happening. And you could see that there was a group with their little NGO vests on, and they were down at the buses, and they were separating out the men from the women and children. And then they further separated out women and children from pregnant women. So if you were pregnant, but you didn't have any children accompanying you at the time, you were put in a third line. And then all of those pregnant young women and teens, most of them that I saw on video, had a yellow packet. And they were being marched down the street to a different building, Catholic Charities organization, non-governmental organization who was helping these young moms to be. And one of them asked the citizen reporter for help. She said, well, in Spanish. Then she said, what do you need help with? And they took my phone, they took my passport, and they gave me this packet. I don't know where we're going. That was the translated message. So I ask you, is that much different from orphan trains? Is that much different from any other type of illegal movement of human beings? I don't think it is. I bring this up just to illustrate the fact that it doesn't matter if it was 1788, 1888, 1988, 2024. This stuff has always happened. It's always been a part of the playbook of the elites who have gross disregard for human life and move them where and when and how it benefits them, not the actual beings that is being taken advantage of. There's always been a battle for dark versus light. There's always been a battle for good versus evil. And there always will be. While we're in this duality dimension, that's what it's about. And it's about giving you the free will choice being to make the opportunity to make the decision. Higher timeline, in alignment to source creator and of the light, service to others. Or lower timeline, not in alignment to source creator and service to self. There is many culpable entities here. So you've got the labor unions mentioned several times. You've got the illegal movement of people and innocence. When I say innocence, I mean the weak and the vulnerable. And those were, a lot of them in this day and age were immigrants again. And they were moved and said, you will work here and you will be thankful for it. And you will not be paid if you get injured. And your family will not be paid if you get injured and die. So don't get injured and die. That's basically what was happening. So these laws that came about really affected the bottom line and the overall work culture of these factories. And this was the heyday of big industrial movements. This made Nixon the enemy of the elites. He was good for the people, not good for business. And he was good for the environment. And he wanted communism to stay out of the United States of America. Is that sounding familiar to you in this day and time, in this now moment? It does to me. So he transformed and helped transform the industries, chemical engineering, automobile engineering, steel, coal, mining, transportation, through the EPA and OSHA and workers' compensation. It radically changed the industrial movement. So there are many beings that stood to lose money, lose their way of life that they had gotten accustomed to, lose the cover of their deviant acts that they were participating in. And so I couldn't help but draw a comparison to the things that had been taking place then and a lot of the things that are taking place now. And I want to say, 2024, why have we not learned? Why have we not stopped this craziness? Why have we allowed it to happen? If you want to be uh, an of the light, an alignment to source creator, and doing your very, very best for humanity, I ask you to be a part of a positive change and don't just sit there complacently letting the same things happen and play out decade after decade after decade. We are losing our country with that bullshit. Thank you for joining me today for Founding Fathers Discovery Series, Richard Milhouse Nixon. He was one of the good ones.